The summer sun dipped low over the backyard barbecue that afternoon, casting a golden haze across the picnic tables laden with potato salad bowls, corn on the cob wrapped in foil, and platters of Dad's signature ribs glistening under the sauce, while I, Emily Harper, 38 and feeling every bit the overlooked middle child, moved quietly among the guests, refilling iced tea pitchers and wiping condensation from the sides of coolers, my hands sticky from handling the napkins that everyone else discarded without a second thought, because that's how these family gatherings always unfolded in our suburban corner of Ohio, where the neighbors popped over with their store-bought desserts and pretended not to notice the subtle hierarchies that played out like a well-rehearsed script from some outdated family sitcom. Mom, with her perfectly coiffed hair and that apron tied just so around her waist, fluttered from one cluster of relatives to another, her laughter ringing out whenever Laura, my sister, shared one of her polished stories about her high-flying marketing job in the city, the kind of tales that involved client dinners at upscale bistros and spontaneous trips to art exhibits that made everyone ooh and ah as if she were some sort of prodigy who'd escaped the mundane life the rest of us clung to. Dad manned the grill with his tongs, flipping burgers and hot dogs, his face flushed from the heat and the pride that swelled whenever Laura complimented his technique, calling it legendary in that effortless way she had. The one that drew smiles and nods from aunts and uncles who nodded along, forgetting entirely that I was the one who'd driven over early that morning to set up the folding chairs and string the lights across the patio. Tasks that never earned a mention but kept the whole event from descending into chaos. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows lengthened under the old oak tree that had stood sentinel in our yard since I was a kid, the toasts began in earnest, starting with Cousin Mark raising his beer bottle to the summer itself and then passing the metaphorical baton to Dad, who clinked his glass against Mom's with a resonant chime that cut through the chatter like a call to attention. His voice booming across the yard as he declared, "To Laura, our pride and joy, the one who's taken the world by storm out there in Chicago with her big career and that beautiful apartment overlooking the lake, always making us so darn proud with every step she takes," and the group erupted in cheers, cousins clapping Laura on the back while she basked in the glow, her cheeks flushing just enough to look humble, though I knew from years of watching her that it was all part of the performance, the one that had started back in high school when she got the lead in the school play and I was stuck building the sets behind the scenes. I stood there by the serving table, stacking the empty plates with their remnants of coleslaw and baked beans, my smile fixed in place like a mask, feeling the familiar twist in my gut that came from being the invisible thread holding everything together. The sister who handled the real estate showings for harried families in search of their American dream while Laura jetted off to conferences, the one who called Mom every Sunday to check on Dad's blood pressure meds even as they overlooked my own quiet milestones, like buying my little ranch house on the edge of town with no fanfare or family loans to grease the wheels. No one turned to me, no glass raised in acknowledgement of the weekends I'd spent weeding their garden or balancing their checkbook when Dad's eyes started to falter, just the ongoing hum of praise for the golden child who, let's face it, had always landed the softest cushions in our family's uneven distribution of affection. By the time the sun had fully surrendered to dusk, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple that reminded me of those childhood evenings when we'd play tag until the fireflies came out, I had cleared most of the debris. My arms aching from lugging trash bags to the curb and rinsing the first load of dishes under the outdoor faucet, the water cold against my skin as I scrubbed away the grease that seemed to symbolize the residue of all those unspoken slights. Mom glanced my way once, her brow furrowing slightly as if she might say something, but then Laura launched into another anecdote about a recent award at work, pulling everyone's attention back like a magnet, and I seized the moment to slip away, murmuring a vague, "Gotta hit the road early tomorrow," to no one in particular, my goodbye lost in the laughter that followed one of Dad's corny jokes about grilling mishaps from years past. Driving home along the winding county roads, the headlights of my reliable old sedan cutting through the gathering dark, that dull ache settled deeper into my chest, not the sharp stab of fresh hurt, but the persistent throb of accumulated years, the kind that builds from a lifetime of being the reliable one. The fixer who mends the fences without ever getting invited to the party on the other side, and I wondered, not for the first time, if this was just how it would always be, with me fading into the background while Laura shone, her light casting long shadows that swallowed my own efforts whole. The house felt emptier than usual when I pulled into the driveway, the porch light flickering on automatically as if to welcome a ghost, and I kicked off my shoes in the entryway, the tile cool under my feet after the day's heat. Before heading to the kitchen for a glass of water, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. That's when my phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with a text from Laura that stopped me cold, her words appearing one after another in a cascade that made my pulse quicken. "Mom's shattered and crying for hours now. Did you say something to her before you left?" The message hung there, innocuous on the surface, but loaded with implication, as if my quiet departure could have unleashed some torrent I'd been oblivious to, and I stared at it, thumb hovering over the keyboard, my mind racing back through the evening's final moments, replaying the clink of glasses, the chorus of laughter, the way I'd stacked those last chairs without a word, wondering if perhaps my silence had finally echoed louder than any outburst ever could. What could have set Mom off like that, after all the toasting and cheer, and why would Laura assume it was me, the one who never rocked the boat, the plate cleaner who faded into the scenery? I set the phone down, poured that water, but didn't drink it, the uncertainty coiling tight in my stomach like a spring ready to snap, because if nothing I'd done or said had caused this, then maybe the real fracture had been there all along, hidden beneath the layers of family ritual and favoritism that we'd all pretended not to see. Sleep didn't come easy that night, the ceiling fan whirring above my bed as I tossed, fragments of the barbecue replaying in loops, the scent of charcoal lingering on my clothes, the warmth of the evening air against my skin. The way Dad's eyes had lit up when Laura arrived, hugging her like she was the returning hero while I unpacked the coolers alone, and by the time morning light filtered through the blinds, I was already drafting a response in my head, something measured but pointed, because perhaps this was the crack I needed to pry open the truth about why I always ended up with the mess while she got the glory. Work called, of course, another day of showing properties to wide-eyed couples dreaming of white picket fences, but Laura's text shadowed every interaction, making me smile a little too tightly at clients and check my phone obsessively during breaks, until finally, during lunch in the office break room with its stale coffee and vending machine hum, I couldn't resist any longer and typed back, "No, just left early like I said." What's got her so upset? And hit send, the whoosh of the message carrying with it a spark of something new, a quiet defiance that felt foreign but fitting, like the first step toward rewriting the script we'd all followed for too long. As the afternoon dragged on with open houses and paperwork, my mind wandered to old family albums tucked away in the attic, photos where Laura always stood front and center, her smile radiant, while I lingered on the edges. And I made a mental note to dig them out later, because maybe understanding the roots of this favoritism would arm me with the clarity to address it head-on, or at least to stop cleaning up after it without a fight. The real shift came that evening, after a long day of sealing a deal on a cozy bungalow for a young family, when I returned home to find the text thread still silent, no follow-up from Laura, which only heightened the mystery, and in a moment of impulsive clarity, I opened our seldom-used family group chat, scrolling past the outdated birthday wishes and holiday greetings until I landed on a photo I'd snapped discreetly during cleanup, me balancing a towering stack of plates with a wry expression, and I posted it with a caption that read, "Behind every great family barbecue stands the one handling the aftermath, grateful for these moments, messy as they are." Simple words on the surface, but laced with just enough subtext to make them pause, to wonder if my quiet exit had been more loaded than they realized, and as likes trickled in from distant cousins, I leaned back on the couch, a small smile tugging at my lips, because this wasn't yelling or storming off, just a clever nudge in the right direction, a witty reminder that the plate cleaner had a story too, and whatever storm Laura's text had hinted at, it was brewing into something I intended to weather on my own terms. leaving the uncertainty to simmer until the next revelation bubbled up. Laura's response arrived right in the middle of my afternoon break, buzzing through the speakers of my car as I sat parked in the office lot with a half-eaten turkey sandwich forgotten on the dashboard. The voice message crackling to life with her familiar cadence that always carried that mix of concern and subtle superiority, the kind she'd honed over years of being the one everyone turned to for advice whether she had it or not. And as she spoke about Mom being a complete wreck since early morning, huddled on the living room couch with her favorite Afghan wrapped around her shoulders and tears streaming down her face in a way that hadn't happened since Dad's retirement scare a few years back, I felt that familiar coil of irritation tightening in my chest because here she was, framing it all as some mysterious family crisis, without once acknowledging how her own spotlight-grabbing tendencies might have contributed to the emotional undercurrents that finally boiled over after the barbecue's forced cheer. She went on to describe how Mom had woken up unusually early, padding into the kitchen in her slippers to brew coffee, but ending up staring out the window at the backyard where the remnants of our gatherings still lingered in scattered lawn chairs and a forgotten cooler, her voice breaking as she muttered something about feeling like the family was drifting apart faster than she could hold onto it, and Laura, ever the interpreter, suggested that perhaps my early departure had triggered some deeper regret in Mom about not appreciating the quieter members of the clan, the ones who didn't make grand entrances, but kept the wheels turning behind the scenes, which made me grip the steering wheel harder because if anyone was drifting, it was them. Always floating toward Laura's orbit while I anchored everything from the periphery without so much as a thank you note. I let the message play out, her wrapping up with a plea to call her back as soon as possible so we could figure out how to support Mom through whatever this was, and then I hit redial immediately, the engine still off and the summer heat pressing in through the windows as the line connected with that telltale ring that always seemed to echo my growing frustration. When she picked up, her hello came quick and breathy, like she'd been pacing while waiting, and I jumped right in without preamble, asking her to lay it all out because I wasn't about to let her spin this into another narrative where I was the distant one pulling away from the warmth of our so-called close-knit family. And she dove into the details with that organized precision she prided herself on, recounting how after I'd slipped out the night before, the conversation around the fire pit had meandered into reminiscences about our childhood summers in that old split-level house on Maple Street, the one with the wraparound porch where we'd set up lemonade stands and chased fireflies until the streetlights buzzed on. But Dad had steered it toward how proud he was of Laura's trajectory, her move to the city after college, the way she'd climbed the corporate ladder at her marketing firm with deals that took her to boardrooms in New York and client schmoozes in Miami, contrasting it unintentionally with the rest of us who had stayed put in Ohio, building lives around real estate offices and local community events rather than chasing the big city glamour. Mom, according to Laura, had taken Dad's words to heart a little too deeply, her face crumpling as she admitted out loud for the first time that maybe she leaned too hard on certain kids while taking others for granted. The tears starting then and flowing steadily through the night until Laura had stayed over to comfort her, brewing chamomile tea and listening to the same worries about aging and irrelevance that I'd heard 100 times on my weekly check-in calls, and when Laura finally asked if I'd said anything pointed before leaving, like a comment about the toast or the uneven attention, I couldn't help but let out a short, incredulous laugh that echoed in the confined space of my car, responding that the only thing I'd said was a mumbled goodbye while stacking chairs, and if that qualified as incendiary, then our family's powder keg was even more volatile than I'd realized. We circled the topic for what felt like ages, me defending my choice to bow out early after a full day of setup and cleanup that no one else seemed to notice, her insisting that Mom's outburst was just the emotional toll of getting older and seeing her daughters' lives diverge in such stark ways, with Laura's successes highlighting the quieter paths like mine. But as the call wound down, I caught a snippet in the background, Dad's gruff voice filtering through what must have been speakerphone, as he grumbled to Mom about how I'd always been a bit distant lately, probably nursing some old jealousy over Laura's spotlight, and that single word, jealousy, landed like a misplaced accusation from a bad courtroom drama, igniting a spark of anger that had me ending the call abruptly with a promise to check in later, the engine roaring to life as I peeled out of the lot toward home. The drive back unfolded with a torrent of memories crashing in, pulling me along those same county roads lined with familiar farmhouses and cornfields that swayed in the breeze, transporting me straight to our teenage years when the favoritism first took root like weeds in an untended garden, back to the days when Laura was the undisputed star of our household, breezing through high school as the art club president who won regional awards for her charcoal sketches of cityscapes she'd never even seen, earning that shiny new convertible for her 16th birthday because Mom and Dad said she deserved a fresh start after the pressures of being so talented. While I slogged through my shifts at the local diner flipping pancakes for truckers and saving every tip for community college tuition, only to come home and find her sketches framed on the fridge next to report cards that got a perfunctory "good job" before the conversation shifted back to her latest drama with the drama club director. I'd been the one patching things up after her escapades, like the time she snuck out to a concert and dented the family station wagon on a curb, me covering for her with a story about borrowing it for a study group while she slept in the next morning unscathed. And Mom would fuss over her with ice cream and pep talks about following her dreams, dismissing my exhaustion with a pat on the back and a reminder to keep up the grades, the pattern so ingrained that by my early 20s, when I moved into my first apartment and landed my real estate license after night classes, there was no celebration dinner, just a quick phone call where Dad mentioned Laura's latest internship in passing as the real highlight. Those flashbacks blurred the road ahead, making me swerve slightly around a pothole as I gripped the wheel tighter, the resentment bubbling up not as fresh rage, but as a steady undercurrent that explained why the barbecue's toast had cut so deep. Why hearing Dad label me jealous now felt like salt in a wound I'd bandaged over for decades, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun hanging lower and casting long shadows across the lawn, I was resolved to do something about it. Starting with an unannounced visit to the folks' house under the guise of retrieving that leftover potato salad Mom had pressed on me the night before. Letting myself in through the unlocked back door as always, the scent of Dad's pipe tobacco mingling with the faint aroma of last night's ribs still warming in the oven. I found them in the kitchen where Mom was wiping down counters with that frantic energy she deployed whenever emotions ran high, her movements precise, but her eyes distant, and Dad sat at the table nursing a mug of black coffee, his newspaper folded but unread beside him. Mom's face lit up with genuine surprise as she pulled me into a hug that smelled of lavender soap and lingering barbecue smoke, exclaiming how nice it was to see me so soon after the gathering. And we eased into small talk about the weather turning cooler and my latest house showing to a couple from out of state, but I gently steered the conversation toward the morning's turmoil, mentioning Laura's call and expressing concern in a way that invited them to open up without accusation. Dad grunted in response, setting his mug down with a clink that echoed his discomfort, and admitted that the barbecue had stirred up more than just good memories, with Mom nodding along as she shared how the toasts had made her reflect on all the ways the family had evolved, Laura soaring high while I, in her words, had become the steadfast rock they could always count on for everything from yard work to emotional support during Dad's health scares. It was the closest they'd come to an apology, but when Dad added that Laura worried I might be pulling away out of resentment, I felt that spark flare again, biting back the urge to point out that pulling away was a natural response to being perpetually sidelined. Instead, excusing myself after grabbing the salad container from the fridge, my eyes catching sight of the mail pile on the hall table as I headed out, a thick manila envelope from a law firm peeking out among the utility bills and catalogs that I couldn't resist photographing discreetly with my phone before stepping into the evening air. Alone later that night with a forkful of the creamy potato salad that tasted more of nostalgia than flavor, I replayed the visit and the call, the word jealousy echoing like a bad punchline in one of those family comedies where the underdog finally gets wise. And it struck me how absurd it all was. Laura, with her city perks and professional network, probably couldn't fathom the daily grind of negotiating contracts for modest family homes or mediating disputes between sellers and buyers, yet here they were painting me as the envious one for wanting a sliver of recognition after years of quiet contribution. That realization fueled my first deliberate step toward balance, a clever little maneuver born from knowing Laura's world a bit too well through mutual acquaintances, as I crafted an anonymous email from a burner account to her assistant at the firm, tipping off a minor oversight in her prized client pitch that I'd overheard her boasting about during a holiday dinner last year. Nothing career-ending, but enough to force her to double-check and sweat a delivery she'd assumed was flawless, the satisfaction washing over me like a cool breeze after a hot day as I hit send and imagined her scrambling in her high-rise office. It wasn't about destruction, just a witty redirection of the spotlight, a way to remind her that even pride and joys could fumble, and by the time I crawled into bed with the day's tensions easing slightly, my phone pinged with a red receipt that confirmed the message had landed, leaving me with a quiet grin in the dark because for once, the fixer was flipping the script without breaking a sweat. The following morning dawned with the insistent chirp of birds outside my window, pulling me from a restless sleep filled with dreams of old family photos where faces blurred into accusations. And as I rummaged through the attic later that afternoon under the pretense of sorting old tax documents for an upcoming audit, my fingers brushed against a dusty cardboard box labeled in Mom's neat handwriting as family keepsakes, the lid creaking open to reveal a jumble of yellowed envelopes, faded Polaroids, and trinkets from our girlhood that I hadn't touched in years, but one item in particular caught my eye, a sealed letter postmarked from Grandma's address 2 decades earlier. Its edges brittle and the handwriting on the front addressed to Mom in a way that promised secrets long buried under layers of favoritism and forgotten toasts. The letter's paper felt fragile between my fingers as I unfolded it carefully in the dim attic light that filtered through a small grimy window, the air thick with the musty scent of old cardboard and forgotten summers. And Grandma's handwriting looped across the pages in that elegant cursive she'd taught us both as kids during rainy afternoons at her farmhouse kitchen table, her words jumping out immediately with phrases like, "You must protect our little Laura. She's always been the fragile one since that awful tumble, and don't let Emily carry the weight alone, but shield the truth about your husband's lapse that summer," which sent a chill racing down my spine because fragile had never been a word anyone associated with Laura, the girl who'd scaled the neighbor's oak tree at age 12 to rescue a stranded kitten only to misjudge her landing and plummet from the roof's edge, breaking her arm in 2 places with a crack that echoed through the yard while I stood frozen at the bottom. My 10-year-old heart pounding as Mom rushed out screaming and Dad fumbled for his keys to drive her to the emergency room, the whole ordeal turning into weeks of casts and doctor visits where Mom doted on her like a porcelain doll, bringing trays of Jell-O and storybooks to her bedside while I was tasked with fetching ice packs and canceling playdates without complaint. I read on, piecing together the hints that the accident wasn't just bad luck but tied to something deeper, Grandma urging Mom to keep Dad's mistake under wraps, a vague reference to his work troubles that had him drinking more than usual that season. The kind of paternal stress that spilled over into distracted supervision on the day of the fall, and how they'd all conspired to frame it as Laura's daring adventure gone wrong rather than a failure of care, the favoritism blooming from that overcompensation as Mom and Dad showered her with extra attention to heal not just the bone but the imagined trauma, leaving me to navigate the household chores and emotional voids without the same buffer, a pattern that explained so much about the barbecue toasts and the quiet resentments I'd buried under layers of responsibility over the years. Tucking the letter into my pocket with a sense of weight that pulled at my steps as I descended the attic stairs, the wooden treads creaking underfoot like reluctant confessions, I carried that discovery through the rest of the week, turning every mundane interaction into a puzzle piece slotting into place, from the way Mom's texts about grocery lists always mentioned Laura's dietary preferences, first to the casual family emails where Dad forwarded articles on career success that seemed tailored to her urban climb rather than my grounded real estate hustle, and by Thursday evening, The invitation arrived via a group message from Mom, a simple request for a Sunday dinner at the house to catch up properly after the barbecue dust settled. Her words laced with that hopeful tone she used when mending fences, though I suspected it was more about smoothing over the emotional ripples Laura had reported, so I replied affirmatively while my mind raced ahead to how I might steer the conversation toward these unearthed roots without unleashing a full storm. The days leading up blurred into a rhythm of client meetings in sunlit living rooms where prospective buyers oohed over granite countertops and hardwood floors, my professional smile masking the internal churn as I replayed Grandma's warnings, wondering if confronting the past would finally grant me the visibility I'd craved or just widen the family fissures that had started cracking under the weight of that overlooked toast, and all the while, Laura's silence on the letter's implications. No, she didn't know about it yet, hung like an unspoken challenge, daring me to disrupt the narrative she'd helped construct over decades of being the unchallenged star. Sunday arrived with a crisp autumn bite in the air that nipped at my cheeks as I drove over with a store-bought apple pie still warm from the bakery, its flaky crust promising sweetness amid the brewing tension, and the house looked much as it always did. The front lawn mowed neat by some neighborhood kid and the American flag fluttering from the porch pole, a symbol of the stable life we'd all pretended to share without examining the uneven foundations. Mom greeted me at the door with a flour-dusted apron and a hug that lingered a beat too long, her eyes searching mine for signs of lingering upset from the barbecue, while Dad waved from the kitchen where the roast chicken sizzled in the oven, filling the air with savory herbs and garlic that masked the undercurrent of unease, and we settled into the dining room with its familiar oak table set for four, the extra place setting confirming Laura's impending arrival, which she made fashionably late as always, sweeping in with canvas totes, bulging with artisanal cheeses and a bottle of Pinot Noir she'd picked up from some trendy vineyard on her last city escape, her entrance announced by the jingle of keys and a burst of chatter about traffic on the interstate that had delayed her. Dinner commenced with the easy flow of surface pleasantries, forks clinking against plates as we passed the mashed potatoes and green beans, Dad regaling us with tales of his latest fishing trip to the lake where he'd caught a bass big enough to brag about at the hardware store, Mom chiming in with updates on the garden club ladies and their fall planting schemes. But the atmosphere shifted subtly when Laura steered the talk to work, lamenting a recent project hiccup at her firm where a key client presentation had hit a snag due to an overlooked detail in the research packet, her voice carrying that mix of frustration and resilience that always endeared her to them, and I nearly sputtered on a bite of chicken, the irony bubbling up like unexpected fizz in a flat soda because that very oversight was the fruit of my anonymous tip earlier in the week, a clever seed planted to make her pause and reflect on how even the pride and joy could stumble without the safety net of family applause. As the meal progressed and the wine loosened tongues just enough, Dad leaned back in his chair with a contented sigh and pivoted to nostalgia, his eyes twinkling as he reminisced about that fateful summer of Laura's accident, calling her a real champ for bouncing back from the cast and crutches with her spirit unbroken, the way she decorated the plaster with markers and turned recovery into an art project that won praise at school, while Mom nodded vigorously, her fork pausing midair as she added how proud they'd been of her resilience, but when their gazes flicked toward me briefly, as if remembering my role in the aftermath, Laura interjected smoothly with a laugh that filled the room, crediting me as her personal nurse and total boss. During those weeks, a nod that sounded generous on the surface, but carried the undertone of relegating me to sidekick status once again, and I responded with a measured smile, saying something about how even pride and joys needed a backup. Sometimes, the words landing with just enough edge to make Mom's smile falter and Dad clear his throat uncomfortably. The tension thickened like gravy left too long on the stove as plates were cleared, me rising instinctively to help rinse and load the dishwasher despite Laura's offer to assist, and in the hallway afterward, away from the parental earshot, she pulled me aside with a hand on my arm, her whisper urgent as she asked if I was sure I hadn't said anything to Mom before bolting from the barbecue, her eyes narrowing with that probing intensity she reserved for reading between lines, and I met her gaze. steadily, replying that maybe Mom was just waking up to the fact that not everyone in the family glittered quite as brightly, a retort that made her bristle visibly before Dad's call for coffee drew us back to the table, the unspoken barbs lingering like smoke from a dying fire. That night, alone in my kitchen with the remnants of the pie cooling on the counter and the house settling into quiet, I dissected the dinner's undercurrents, the humor of Laura's work woes providing a wry counterpoint to the heavier revelations from the letter. And it struck me how the whole evening had unfolded like one of those awkward family reunions in a Midwestern novel, full of half-truths and polite deflections that hid the real fractures, prompting me to fire off a casual text to our cousin Jenny, who'd helped sort Grandma's things after her passing, inquiring if there might be more letters or documents tucked away in the family safe that could shed light on that summer's shadows. Her quick reply affirming the possibility with a note about Mom hoarding a bundle of old correspondence, which only fueled my determination to uncover more without tipping my hand too soon. My next move toward evening the scales came naturally from observing Laura's social media habits, her feeds a curated showcase of triumphs and travels that begged for a subtle puncture, so I set up a throwaway account mimicking an old college acquaintance she'd mentioned in passing years ago, following her profile and dropping innocuous comments on recent posts like, "Still owning the world out there, remember those late-night chats about your hidden doubts?" The vagueness designed to unsettle without alarm, a witty infiltration that played on her love of validation while planting seeds of paranoia, and by morning, as I sipped coffee over the newspaper, her stories popped up with cryptic mentions of weird imposters lurking in the likes, drawing a satisfied chuckle from me because it was the perfect petty prod. Satisfying in its cleverness without crossing into malice, leaving me to ponder if such small revenges were mending my wounds or just widening the family's divides. The week pressed on with its usual cadence of property tours and contract signings, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot during walks to clear my head, but the pull of family secrets kept drawing me back, culminating in an unexpected call from Mom during a slow afternoon at the office, her voice trembling slightly over the line as she insisted I come over that very evening for a serious talk, the kind that promised revelations or reckonings. And as I hung up with agreement, the uncertainty swelled once more, leaving me to wonder what bombshell awaited and whether my growing boldness would finally force the truth into the light or shatter the fragile peace we'd all maintained for so long. The driveway seemed longer than usual that evening as I guided my car toward the house under a sky bruised with twilight hues, the headlights catching the edges of fallen leaves skittering across the pavement like whispered warnings, and my stomach twisted into knots reminiscent of those first nervous dates in my 20s when uncertainty loomed larger than the man across the table, because Mom's call had carried that rare quiver in her voice, the one reserved for moments when the family's carefully constructed facade threatened to crumble under the weight of unspoken truths, pulling me back to the childhood home where so many of those truths had taken root amid the scent of Mom's pot roast and Dad's evening newspaper rustle. She met me at the door before I could even knock, her silhouette framed in the warm glow of the entryway light, her face etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights since the barbecue, and without a word she drew me into an embrace that felt more like seeking solace than offering it, her lavender-scented sweater brushing my cheek as Dad appeared behind her in the hallway, fiddling with his glasses in that habitual way he had when words failed him, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the gravity of whatever they had decided to unearth. We moved into the living room where the old floral couch sagged under our weight like an old friend bearing too many secrets, the coffee table cluttered with coasters and a half-empty bowl of mixed nuts that no one touched, and Mom began tentatively, her hands clasped in her lap as she admitted that the barbecue had acted like a catalyst, stirring regrets about how they'd always leaned on me for the practicalities of life, the weekend visits to fix the leaky faucet, the calls to troubleshoot Dad's computer glitches, the quiet support during their health scares, without ever voicing the appreciation that might have made those efforts feel seen rather than expected, a confession that hung in the air heavy with the implication that my silent departure had finally illuminated the imbalance they'd long ignored. Dad shifted uncomfortably on the couch, his calloused hands rubbing together as he reached for the side table drawer and pulled out that familiar manila envelope I'd glimpsed in the mail pile days earlier. The one from the law firm with its official seal that now felt like a Pandora's box in this domestic setting, and he cleared his throat before explaining that they were in the process of updating their will. A task they'd put off for years amid the busyness of retirement, hobbies, and family milestones, but the recent emotional fallout had prompted a reevaluation of legacies and fairness. The words spilled out slowly at first, then with more conviction, as he detailed how Laura's established career in the city with its steady income and urban independence positioned her well for the future, whereas my role as the local anchor, the one who'd poured sweat equity into maintaining the family home through repairs and upgrades over the years, deserved tangible recognition in the form of the house itself, its equity built not just from their savings, but from my countless interventions that kept mortgage payments low and values high. I sat there, the revelation washing over me like a sudden rain after a drought, my mind reeling from the unexpected pivot because for as long as I could remember, the house had been tacitly earmarked as Laura's inheritance, the crown jewel to match her golden child status, the place where she'd return in some imagined future to host grand holiday gatherings while I made do with my modest ranch on the outskirts, and hearing them articulate this shift now, attributing it to the sting of my quiet goodbye at the barbecue, filled me with a complex brew of relief and lingering bitterness, because why had it taken the echo of my absence to prompt such clarity, and what role had Laura played in the previous assumptions that favored her so heavily? Mom's eyes welled up as she elaborated on the catalyst, describing how my early exit had replayed in her mind like a looped film reel, highlighting the ways they'd taken my reliability for granted while celebrating Laura's flashier achievements. And in a moment of raw vulnerability, she confessed that the tears after the barbecue stemmed from a deeper fear of losing the daughter who'd always been there without fanfare, the one who balanced their checkbooks and mowed the lawn even as life pulled her in a dozen directions with her real estate career and solitary evenings. The conversation stretched into hours, the living room lamp casting long shadows across the walls adorned with family photos where Laura's smiling face dominated the frames from proms and graduations, and as we delved into the past, Dad opened up about the origins of the favoritism, admitting it had intensified after Laura's accident all those years ago, how they'd overcompensated for her physical and emotional recovery by shielding her from the household stresses, particularly his own work demotion that summer when the factory laid off half the line and he drowned his anxieties in late-night beers, a mistake in judgment that led to lax supervision on the day she fell. The lie they told themselves and us that it was just youthful recklessness rather than parental oversight gone awry. Grandma's letter, which I pulled from my purse to share for the first time, served as the missing link, its faded words corroborating Dad's halting narrative about burying the truth to protect the family unit. Mom's overcorrections manifesting as endless praise for Laura's resilience, while I was left to shoulder the practical burdens without the emotional cushion. A dynamic that had calcified over decades into the barbecue toasts and overlooked goodbyes that now seemed like symptoms of a deeper malaise. As the pieces clicked into place during that extended talk, the initial shock gave way to a moral dilemma that gnawed at me like an unsolved puzzle. The temptation to forgive and embrace this belated equity warring with the urge to probe further into how deeply the favoritism had embedded itself, especially since Laura's original text about Mom's tears now reframed itself in my mind not as genuine sisterly concern, but as a calculated probe, her way of gauging the family's fault lines before any major decisions like the will update could disrupt her assumed advantages. Driving home through the darkened streets where porch lights flickered like hesitant beacons, the weight of their admission settled alongside a frustration that bordered on exasperation. What a tangled web of good intentions and blind spots they'd woven over the years. Like some convoluted family saga scripted by life itself without the neat resolutions of television dramas, and it fueled my resolve to address the imbalances on my terms, even if it meant navigating the gray areas where loyalty clashed with self-preservation. The next morning brought clarity amid the routine of brewing coffee and scanning property listings, as I reflected on Laura's habit of positioning herself as the savvy one in financial matters, often dispensing inheritance advice to friends at cocktail parties while remaining blissfully ignorant, or perhaps willfully so, of our own family's dynamics, and from a shared contact in her professional circle, I learned she'd been consulting advisors lately, likely angling to safeguard her interests in light of the barbecue's aftermath. My retaliation took shape as a precise, anonymous voicemail to her firm's human resources department, delivered in a neutral tone from a blocked number and posing as a vaguely concerned associate, hinting at potential ethical overlaps between her personal family dealings and client confidences without specifics that could invite scrutiny. The irony. Delicious in how it mirrored her self-image as untouchable while forcing a routine review that would keep her off balance for weeks, a witty inversion of the scales that provided immense satisfaction as I imagined her navigating the fallout in her sleek office, her perfect poise cracking just enough to humanize the pride and joy. Yet, even as that clever prod landed, sleep proved elusive that night, the will's implications replaying alongside the accident's full context, and in the quiet hours before dawn, while sorting through archived emails on my laptop for an unrelated client file, I stumbled upon an old attachment from 5 years prior, a scanned draft of Dad's previous will sent accidentally during a family document merge, its clauses stark in their favoritism toward Laura with substantial assets earmarked for her stability while mine were relegated to token gestures like a modest vehicle and savings bond, the marginal notes in Dad's scrawl referencing her need for security during a career dip that I'd only vaguely recalled. Staring at the screen in the glow of my desk lamp, heart pounding with the discovery of this concrete evidence of long-term bias, the betrayal sharpened into focus. Not a sudden shift, but a deliberate tilt that had persisted until guilt and my silence forced a course correction, leaving me to grapple with what to do next in a web of revelations that threatened to upend everything. The scanned document glowed accusingly on my laptop screen in the pre-dawn hush of my home office, its digital edges sharp as the betrayal it laid bare. Dated 5 years earlier during a period when family emails had buzzed with updates on Laura's career highs and my quieter professional strides. The clauses within favoring her overwhelmingly with the bulk of the estate, including the house's deed and a significant chunk of retirement savings earmarked for her future stability, while my portions were pared down to a used car allowance and a small life insurance payout, marginal notes in Dad's familiar block letters justifying it all as necessary support for the daughter navigating a volatile job market in the city. A rationale that overlooked my own self-made path through real estate commissions and solo homeownership, without the safety nets they'd extended her way over the years. My hands trembled slightly as I printed the pages on my desk printer, the machine's rhythmic were echoing in the empty room like a heartbeat accelerating toward confrontation, because this wasn't mere oversight, but a calculated preference that had shaped our interactions from college graduations to holiday toasts. The kind of favoritism that explained the barbecue sting and the quiet resentments I'd harbored while fixing their gutters and mediating their spats, and as the first light of morning crept through the blinds, casting striped patterns across the floor, I folded the printout into my purse with a resolve that felt both empowering and precarious, knowing this evidence could either mend the fractures or widen them into irreparable chasms, pulling me toward the family home for an unannounced visit that morning before work could claim the day. The drive unfolded under a sky lightening to pale blue, the roads less crowded than usual on that weekday, allowing my thoughts to swirl unchecked around the will's implications and the accident's lingering shadows. How Dad's demotion had poisoned that summer's air with unspoken tensions that manifested in lax parenting and overzealous recoveries, channeling all their protective energy toward Laura while I learned early to navigate independence without fanfare, a dynamic that the old draft codified into financial reality, and by the time I pulled up to the curb, the house standing sentinel with its neatly trimmed hedges and the faint scent of Mom's morning coffee wafting from an open window, my pulse thrummed with a mix of anticipation and dread. because confronting them now meant risking the tentative peace from last night's talk, while potentially exposing the depths of their partiality. Mom answered my knock with flour on her apron from what smelled like pancake batter on the griddle, her surprise melting into concern as she ushered me inside to the kitchen where Dad sat at the table with his coffee and the morning paper, his eyebrows rising in that way that signaled he sensed the gravity without knowing its source. And without preamble, I slid the printed pages across the oak surface, watching their faces drain of color as Dad adjusted his glasses to scan the familiar text, Mom's hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of instinctive denial. Dad stammered first, his voice rough with the remnants of sleep and regret, insisting it had been a rough draft from a low point when Laura's job had teetered on layoffs and they'd panicked about her prospects. A temporary measure scrapped long ago in favor of the updated version that recognized my contributions, but the words rang hollow against the timeline. The document predating her promotion by months and aligning too neatly with patterns of preference that stretched back to childhood, prompting me to press gently, but firmly on how such a temporary tilt had influenced everything from birthday gifts to emotional bandwidth, the conversation unfolding in halting waves as Mom nodded through tears, admitting the fear of her fragility post-accident had blinded them to equity, her voice cracking as she described the guilt that had built since the barbecue, amplified by my silent exit that mirrored the invisibility they'd imposed. Just as the air thickened with those admissions, my phone rang on the counter, Laura's name flashing on the screen like an ill-timed intrusion, and in a surge of boldness I answered on speaker, pulling her into the fray without warning as her cheerful morning greeting faltered at the sound of Mom's sniffles and Dad's heavy silence, the line crackling with her questions about what was happening and why everyone sounded so off-kilter. I took the phone firmly, my voice steady as I explained it was family business surfacing old truths, the kind involving wills and long-buried biases that had positioned her as the perpetual priority, and she sputtered on the other end, her city apartment presumably buzzing with the chaos of her getting-ready routine, before confessing in a rush that she'd known about the old draft, even encouraged its terms during a vulnerable stretch in her career when a major client pulled out and left her, doubting her path, thinking she needed the family's full backing to rebuild while assuming I'd always land on my feet as the resilient one. The revelation hit like a twist in one of those suburban dramas we used to watch on cable, her admission laced with a plea for understanding that tugged at my empathy even as it fueled the fury, because scared or not, her nudges had perpetuated the imbalance, turning my reliability into an excuse for exclusion, and the call dissolved into a tangle of voices, Mom's sobs mingling with Dad's attempts at mediation, Laura's apologies tumbling out in fragmented sentences about wanting to make it right, now ending only when the emotional weight proved too much, leaving the kitchen humming with the aftermath as I hung up, the pancake batter forgotten on the stove. From that charged exchange, the climax built inexorably as we three hashed out the full scope of the past, Dad opening up further about the accident's prelude, how his demotion at the factory had come weeks before the fall, the stress manifesting in distracted evenings where he'd retreat to the garage with a six-pack rather than engage, the mistake Grandma referenced in her letter being his fabrication of the story to externalize blame onto Laura's adventure rather than his own failings, a lie that Mom had internalized by overprotecting her, framing every setback as a threat to her confidence while I absorbed the household's practical loads without complaint, the pattern solidifying into the favoritism that colored barbecues and birthdays alike. Dad's voice broke as he acknowledged failing me in the process, his eyes meeting mine with a rawness that spoke of decades-delayed remorse, Mom reaching across the table to clasp my hand and whisper how the barbecue's toast had crystallized. Their oversight, the tears flowing freely now as she vowed to rewrite not just the will but the narrative, ensuring my place wasn't just as the fixer but as an equal in their eyes. Emotions crested in that moment, a whirlwind of pity for their human frailties mingling with the sharp edge of my accumulated hurts, making me question if forgiveness could truly bridge the gap or if my path of subtle revenges had already veered too far into territory that blurred hero and antagonist. The dilemma sharpening as Laura texted mid-discussion with promises to visit soon and discuss amends, her words carrying a vulnerability that humanized her beyond the golden child facade. In the heat of that unraveling, my final act of reckoning took shape not as destruction, but as a clever illumination, forwarding the old will draft to the family email chain, including Laura, with a neutral subject line about organizing old files, and a brief note suggesting everyone review the full history for context, the attachment landing like a quiet grenade that exposed the hypocrisies without accusatory language, allowing the facts to speak and provoke their own reckonings. By midday, as I left the house with hugs that felt tentative but genuine, replies began flooding in Laura's lengthy apology detailing her regrets and offers to contribute equally to any family decisions. Mom's voice message begging for a group dinner to rebuild, Dad's simple text affirming the changes and his pride in the daughter who'd endured without fanfare, and the satisfaction settled deep. A witty closure that balanced the scales through transparency rather than confrontation, leaving me to drive back to work with the radio humming softly, the autumn sun warming the dashboard as I pondered the path ahead. Nightfall found me on the porch steps of my ranch house, the neighborhood settling into quiet with distant laughter from a neighbor's grill and the stars emerging one by one overhead, a glass of red wine in hand as I replayed the day's upheavals. The partial truths unearthed raising as many questions as they answered about whether the favoritism stemmed from malice or misguided love, and if my nudges toward justice had healed the wounds or merely scarred them anew. I composed a final group message, fingers tapping out an invitation to talk openly next time without the shields of toasts or traditions, just raw honesty to navigate whatever came next, and hit send into the cooling air, the phone falling silent in response. An ambiguity that lingered like the wine's aftertaste, prompting reflection on my choices. Had I reclaimed my space as the empowered sister, or tipped into pettiness that might haunt future gatherings? The night offered no clear verdict, only the gentle pull of uncertainty toward tomorrow's uncharted possibilities, leaving the family's future suspended in thoughtful haze.